for a week.
Good idea.
And sleep.
What if we told you that some of the most iconic stars from Hollywood's golden age, those charming, handsome legends adored on screen, were secretly hiding one of the industry's worst-kept secrets? Behind the glamour and allure, many of these leading men were early adopters of cosmetic surgery, specifically hair transplants. During an era when the technology was still in its crude infancy, these procedures meant to restore youthful hairlines often left stars with bizarre and unnatural results. Patchy hair growth, geometric patterns, and plugs that look more like doll hair than human follicles. Instead of enhancing their looks, these transplants drew attention to their vanity and imperfections, with the unfortunate outcome being far worse than the original baldness they sought to hide. Take Frank Sinatra, for example, one of the first celebrities to try hair transplantation in the 1960s. Sinatra underwent a primitive procedure known as punch grafting, where small circular sections of hair-bearing scalp were moved from the back of the head to balding areas. This plug technique left the scalp looking like a patchwork quilt, rows of tiny hair clumps that didn't grow naturally. His transplant was so noticeable that photographers had to carefully light and angle shots to conceal the doll-like texture. The hair itself didn't even match the original. It grew in different directions with a different texture, forcing Sinatra to rely on heavy pomade and styling tricks. During a 1965 television special, under the hot studio lights, his hair separated, revealing the unnatural plugs beneath. Makeup crews scrambled during commercial breaks to fix the mess, underscoring just how visible and embarrassing this cosmetic experiment had become. Next, there was Burt Reynolds. Although his fame blossomed slightly after the traditional golden age, his transplant mishaps began in the early 70s, putting him squarely in the crosshairs of hair restoration disasters. Reynolds underwent several procedures, each attempting to fix the previous one, but only compounding the problems. His hairline ended up too low and unnaturally straight, creating what critics often describe as a painted-on appearance. Worse, the density was wildly inconsistent. Thick in some places, sparse in others. He later admitted that going under the knife was a mistake. His repeated surgeries resulted in permanent scalp damage and scars, making future corrections even more difficult. What's particularly tragic is that Reynolds had natural rugged charm. He didn't need a full head of hair to remain attractive or magnetic. But like many others on this list, the pursuit of youthful looks ended up diminishing his natural appeal. Another Rat Pack icon, Sammy Davis Jr., also suffered through a poorly executed transplant. Performed in the late 1960s, Davis's surgery gave him a bizarrely dense patch at his hairline that didn't blend with the naturally thinning sides and back. The end result was a sort of biological toupee, clearly visible under stage lights. His attempts to hide the transplant, through pompadours, heavy hair products, and complex styling, only highlighted the problem. As time passed, the use of gels and heat styling tools caused more damage to his natural hair, creating a cycle of concealment that spiraled into more artificial fixes like extensions and combovers. His hairline, instead of fading gracefully with age, stood out as a glaring example of cosmetic surgery gone awry. William Shatner, during his Star Trek years, became another cautionary tale. His multiple transplants left him with a shockingly dense and unnaturally uniform hairline that defied the aging process. His face matured as expected, but his hair remained frozen in time, creating a surreal disconnect. The transplanted plugs were placed too closely together and grew like thick bristles, resembling a brush more than a human scalp. The contrast between his evolving facial features and his static, artificial hairline became so noticeable that it became a running joke among fans and media alike. To make matters worse, the scarring from the early procedures meant he couldn't shave his head, trapping him in a lifelong attempt to maintain a facade that no longer fooled anyone. Then there was Tony Curtis, who perhaps endured one of Hollywood's most extensive transplant sagas. His first procedures began in the 1960s, and he continued seeking surgical help for decades afterward. The outdated techniques used on him left behind a visible cornrow pattern on his scalp, with straight lines of hair plugs giving his head a geometric, almost agricultural appearance. Makeup artists often struggle to hide the plugs while filming. As Curtis aged, The stark contrast between the transplanted dark hair and his naturally graying strands made the difference even more pronounced. Eventually, he had to dye all of his hair to create some consistency, but this only resulted in an eerie, unnatural look. His obsession with his hair became so intense that he underwent numerous additional procedures, each worsening the scarring and reducing the effectiveness of subsequent surgeries. Mel Gibson, though more of a modern-era star, also suffered from the legacy of these crude techniques. His transplant, performed before advancements in restoration technology, created what specialists call a forest fire pattern, thick clumps of transplanted hair adjacent to bald patches. The unnatural hairline and density made natural styling impossible, and Gibson had to rely heavily on lighting tricks and camera angles to obscure the problem. Ironically, his original receding hairline gave him a distinguished look that better suited his mature roles, whereas the artificial replacement made him appear strangely youthful in a way that clashed with his aging features. It even caused complications with film directors, who had to limit how he could be shot on screen. John Travolta followed a similar path. In the 1980s, he tried to hold on to his iconic thick hair from Saturday Night Fever and Grease fame. His early transplants gave him a hairline so perfectly symmetrical it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. It lacked the subtle imperfections of a natural hairline, which made it all the more conspicuous. The different textures and growth patterns between his transplanted and original hair created a visible divide that could not be styled away. As high-definition filming became the standard, Travolta's hair issues became even more noticeable, leading to increased scrutiny and mockery from fans and tabloids alike. Elton John's transplant attempts were among the most visible disasters of all. In the 1970s, he underwent procedures that left him with thin, randomly growing plugs that looked worse than his original baldness. The infamous punch graft technique left him with small, circular clumps of hair growing in haphazard directions. Eventually, Elton abandoned transplant entirely and turned his hair into a personal statement with flamboyant wigs and toupees. What began as a cosmetic failure ended up becoming a trademark element of his stage persona. By embracing the artificial rather than hiding it, he managed to turn a disaster into a reinvention that helped define his public identity. Sean Connery, perhaps the most legendary James Bond actor, also had a rough history with hair restoration. His early transplants in the 1970s yielded poor results: patchy growth, mismatched color and texture, and the telltale circular plug scars. Eventually, Connery decided to forego the procedures entirely and embrace his baldness. In doing so, he set a new standard for masculinity in Hollywood. His elegant acceptance of aging and baldness gave him a distinguished appearance that elevated his image and served as an example for countless actors who followed. And finally, we come to Marlon Brando, whose botched hair transplants were kept under wraps for decades. His multiple failed procedures left him with a hairline that was too straight, too low, and completely unflattering to his facial structure. Worse, the plugs grew in odd directions and were uneven in density, making his scalp appear as if it were sprouting weeds through concrete. Brando resorted to wigs and hats for the rest of his life, refusing to be seen without some form of head covering. Makeup artists described the challenge of working with his scalp as one of the most frustrating parts of his preparation. Yet, just like with Connery, Brando's baldness would have better suited the powerful characters he portrayed in his later years. Instead, his vanity trapped him in a cycle of concealment that only grew more elaborate over time. The common thread in all these disasters was the technology of the era. The punch graft or plug method, widely used in the 60s and 70s, involved transplanting large, circular chunks of scalp, for millimeters or so in diameter, from the donor area to balding regions. The result was often grotesque, unnatural clumps that failed to mimic the way real hair grows. These grafts were too large, too circular, and were implanted without regard to the natural direction and angle of hair growth. This created the infamous doll hair look, stiff tufts growing at random angles. In addition to the aesthetic shortcomings, the procedure left scars at both donor and recipient sites, producing visible polka-dot scarring at the back of the head and raised scars at the transplant zones. The surgeons performing these transplants often lacked any artistic sensibility. They approached hair restoration like a technical operation rather than a creative challenge that required harmony with a person's facial structure and age. Their focus was on process, not outcome. As a result, stars who sought a youthful resurgence ended up looking worse than before. And psychologically, the damage was often more severe than the cosmetic flaws they had attempted to fix. These failed transplants made actors hyper-aware of their appearance. Some developed body dysmorphia, constantly chasing surgical corrections for perceived imperfections. The obsession often consumed their personal lives and careers, leading to isolation, reclusiveness, or elaborate routines designed solely to hide their artificial hairlines. Hollywood responded by creating a whole support industry just to mask these problems. Specialized stylists, lighting technicians, and makeup artists became critical players behind the scenes, helping disguise scarring and disguise plug patterns. Even photographers were trained to shoot these actors from specific angles with particular lighting to make their hair appear normal. This elaborate system of concealment became necessary because the procedures themselves were so flawed. But from all this failure came progress. The highly publicized disasters led to better research and more refined surgical techniques. Surgeons eventually understood that successful hair restoration required artistry, an understanding of facial symmetry, hair growth patterns, and the psychology of aging. The mistakes of the past educated a new generation of practitioners. Today, modern techniques like follicular unit extraction (FUE) and follicular unit transplantation (FUD) offer far more natural results with minimal scarring. Ultimately, these golden age stars paid the price for being the pioneers of cosmetic hair restoration. Their failures, though embarrassing, paved the way for the safer and more sophisticated procedures available today. And if there's a lesson to be learned, it's that embracing the aging process often yields a more authentic and attractive appearance than desperately clinging to youth with artificial solutions. As we continue our deep dive into the infamous hair transplant disasters of Hollywood's golden age and beyond, we arrive at some of the most well-known cases that not only shocked fans, but also transformed how the entertainment industry approached image enhancement and cosmetic surgery. John Travolta, once the poster boy for thick, glossy 1970s hair, began experiencing significant hair loss in the 1980s. His attempt to restore it with hair transplants were among the most publicly speculated cosmetic missteps of his era. The result of these early procedures was a hairline that appeared unnaturally perfect, too symmetrical to look anything other than surgically manufactured. Unlike natural hairlines, which contain small irregularities, soft curves, and slight asymmetry, Travolta's transplant formed a straight, hard edge that lacked the softness and imperfection of a true hairline. The contrast between the transplanted follicles and his remaining natural hair added to the problem. The texture, direction, and density of the transplanted hair didn't match the original, resulting in an obvious transition zone that couldn't be styled away. This issue was magnified when Travolta made a comeback in the 1990s with movies like Pulp Fiction and Face Off. With the arrival of high-definition cameras, every hair or plug was visible on screen. Audiences and critics alike noticed the inconsistencies in his hair, fueling rumors and ridicule. Despite efforts to maintain the illusion through styling and lighting, the damage was already done. Travolta would later alternate between hair systems and embracing a clean-shaven look. Music legend Elton John famously struggled with hair loss from a young age. In the 1970s, at the height of his fame, he sought out early hair transplant procedures. Unfortunately, the punch graft techniques of the time offered little more than disappointment. Instead of achieving natural regrowth, Elton was left with scattered clusters of hair that sprouted in different directions, at different angles, and with inconsistent density. This patchwork effect created more visual confusion than his natural baldness ever had. As a man already known for bold style choices and flamboyant stage costumes, Elton tried to camouflage the result with elaborate hats, headbands, and eventually wigs. Ironically, it was the failure of these early transplants that led to the birth of his iconic look. By abandoning the illusion of natural hair and embracing wigs and headpieces as fashion statements, Elton redefined what it meant to own your appearance, turning a cosmetic disaster into an aesthetic triumph. Sean Connery, the original James Bond, began losing his hair in his early 30s. Something many fans don't realize because of how well his baldness was hidden early in his career. However, behind the scenes, Connery underwent multiple failed hair transplants during the early 1970s, trying to restore the full, masculine hairline that helped define his image. The plug technique, common at the time, involved circular tufts of hair that didn't resemble natural growth. For a man known for his rugged charm and suaveness, the unnatural patches of transplanted hair were a stark contrast to his otherwise sophisticated persona. The mismatched textures and coloring between the transplanted plugs and his original hair made it clear something wasn't quite right. Eventually, Connery gave up the fight, shaved his head, and re-emerged as a striking, confident bald man. And surprisingly, his career didn't suffer. In fact, many would argue his sex appeal and screen presence increased. He embodied the idea that baldness could be dignified, mature, and powerful. His transformation marked a cultural shift, showing the world that a man could be both bald and desirable long before it became fashionable. The transplants left him with a rigid, low-set hairline that clashed with his facial structure. The density of the plugs was inconsistent, with some areas looking overly bushy while others were thin and patchy. What made Brando's situation even more difficult was that he reportedly developed significant scarring on his scalp, making it impossible for him to go fully bald or grow hair evenly. A makeup artist who worked with him once described the effect as grass growing through concrete. It was a tragic irony. Brando's natural balding pattern could have complemented the weathered, powerful characters he played in later years. Instead, he spent decades using hats and wigs to hide a condition made worse by a flawed medical procedure. These celebrity disasters weren't just cautionary tales. They serve as turning points in the development of cosmetic surgery and hair restoration. The gruesome results from plug-based procedures forced the industry to reckon with the inadequacies of its methods. Patients, especially high-profile ones, expected natural results, but the technology of the time couldn't deliver. Hair doesn't grow in perfectly circular clumps or straight lines, yet that's exactly what plug techniques created. Surgeons back then didn't fully understand or value the importance of aesthetics in cosmetic procedures. It wasn't just about replacing hair. It was about restoring a natural look. Over time, as the visible failures became more widespread and publicized, doctors began taking a more artistic approach. What often goes unspoken in these stories is the psychological fallout from failed transplants. For many of these stars, the hair loss itself wasn't the primary issue. It was a disfigurement and unnatural appearance that followed surgery. The resulting anxiety led to elaborate routines just to appear in public. Carefully coordinated lighting, camera angles, makeup, and hairstyling, all designed to distract from their scalps. Some stars reportedly became reclusive, avoiding interviews or refusing certain roles. The constant fear of exposure, literally and figuratively, haunted them. These feelings align with what psychologists now identify as body dysmorphic disorder, BD, a condition where individuals become obsessed with flaws in their appearance, real or imagined, to the point where it affects their quality of life. These actors weren't just vain. They were navigating an industry that demanded physical perfection and punished aging. Their careers were, in part, tied to their looks, and hair loss was wrongly equated with weakness or diminished sex appeal. In response to the slew of bad transplants, a secondary industry emerged within Hollywood, one entirely focused on damage control. Specialized hairstylists, wig designers, makeup artists, and lighting technicians became essential crew members on many sets. Some stylists were hired not because they could cut hair well, but because they could make a surgical disaster look halfway natural under stage lights. These professionals developed revolutionary techniques. Scalp concealers to hide scars, powder sprays to blend colors, hair fibers to build the illusion of volume, and wigs that were indistinguishable from real hair. Even photographers learned to manipulate light and angles to obscure telltale signs of surgical failure. Eventually, this illusion maintenance became a standard practice, not just for those with bad surgeries, but also for actors who simply want to prevent aging from affecting their career longevity. While these celebrities suffered the consequences of flawed procedures, their experiences weren't in vain. In fact, their failures spurred innovation. Modern hair transplant surgeons now recognize that their work is not just medical, it's an art. The best practitioners study facial balance, growth angles, and aging patterns. They know that a slightly irregular hairline is more believable than a perfectly straight one. Counseling has also improved. Patients today receive far more comprehensive consultations, including psychological assessments and discussions about realistic outcomes. A good surgeon will advise against overly aggressive hairlines or excessive density in places that don't match a person's age or features. For some of Hollywood's biggest stars, the greatest role they ever played was pretending their hair hadn't betrayed them. What began as a quiet fight against aging turned into a cautionary tale etched across their scalps, in scars, plugs, and painful lessons. But these weren't just cosmetic missteps. They were the growing pains of an industry and a generation, learning that perfection always comes at a cost. If this deep dive into the hidden side of celebrity life struck a chord, hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments. Which of these transformations surprised you most?